Trolley yesterday, Chapter 18. When Johnny got back to his grandparents' house that night, they had no idea that he had been on a dangerous journey through time and space. He drank a cup of cocoa in the kitchen, and his grandma told him that he'd better hurry up and get to bed because there was school in the morning. Fergie called Johnny on the phone later that night, and the two of them had a brief conversation about the wild things that had happened to them. Already the Constantinople adventure had begun to seem like something they had just dreamed about, and yet they knew that it was real. Weeks passed, and it began to look as if Mr. Townsend would be staying at the professor's house for a long time. Mr. Townsend's sister was dead, and there really wasn't anywhere else he could go, unless he took another trip into the past with the time trolley. So the professor brought Mr. Townsend some modern clothes and tried to make him feel at home in the 1950s. This was hard because Mr. Townsend had never heard of Willie Mays, Marilyn Monroe, or automatic shift cars. He said more than once that he felt like a fish out of water, and it was clear to everyone that he was not very happy. During the first week of May, the professor decided to throw a party. This was surprising because he didn't entertain very much, and he always did a lousy job of it when he tried to be a genial, fun-loving host. Nevertheless, plans for the party got underway. The professor sent invitations to all of his friends, and he went to a local store and bought a big supply of balloons, party favors, and paper plates. Saturday night, the 6th of May, arrived, and so did the guests. Grandpa, Grandma, Fergie, Johnny, Mr. Townsend, and Dr. Charles Coote. The professor had ordered plates of cold meat, delicious hors d'oeuvres, and soft drinks, and he had champagne and cognac for the grown-ups. It was a nice party, but everyone wondered, why was the professor throwing this big blowout? As they gobbled food and sipped soda pop, Fergie and Johnny tried to question the professor, but he just smiled blandly. It was all pretty strange. Around 9:30, Grandma and Grandpa went home. The rest of the party-goers gathered upstairs in the professor's study, and he uncorked a bottle of 50-year-old Napoleon brandy. Everybody got some, even the boys, and then the professor proposed a toast. "To our safe return," he said solemnly. He clinked glasses with everyone as they drank. I think Professor Childermass ought to be congratulated for his quick thinking and his courage," said Mr. Townsend, as he refilled his glass. "He really saved the day for all of us, and I'd like to add that—" "I think you've forgotten someone," said Brewster, who had noiselessly appeared on the corner of the desk. "I had a small part in the victory, you may recall." The professor glanced at Brewster over the top of his glasses. "I might have known you'd show up and take all the credit," he said, smiling wryly. All right, you deserve 90% of the credit, to be fair. We apologize for leaving you out, and we salute you. If you hadn't done your Big Bird routine, the boys, Mr. Townsend, and I would be in a slave camp somewhere." "Thank you," rasped Brewster. "Now that I have been given proper credit for my heroic actions, I shall depart. See you in the funny papers." With a faint plip, like a soap bubble popping, Brewster vanished. "Amazing creature," murmured Dr. Coote, as he stared at the place where Brewster had been a second before. "It's hard to believe that he's real." "Oh, he's not real at all," said Mr. Townsend placidly. "He's just an illusion whipped up by a wonderful friend, the professor. I wish I could do tricks like that." The professor gazed at Mr. Townsend in despair. He had tried to convince his friend that Brewster was real, but it was like talking to a stone wall. Finally, reluctantly, he had given up. After a long sip of brandy, the professor harumphed, as he always did when he was going to say something important. "Folks," he said loudly, "I've got an announcement to make, or rather my friend Al Townsend has one." Mr. Townsend coughed nervously and put his glass down on the professor's desk. "I want to tell you, first of all," he said, "that I have enjoyed the professor's hospitality. He is a kind and generous person, and I won't forget what he's done for me. However, I really feel uncomfortable here in the middle of the 20th century. All my friends and relatives are dead, and I feel, well, useless and out of place. So I'm going to use the trolley to go back to Topsfield, Massachusetts in 1896. The professor managed to buy some old-fashioned clothes for me at a costume shop, and I have 2 suitcases packed and ready to go." Dr. Coote was astonished. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed. "Topsfield is a lovely little town and all, but, well, what are you going to do there in the gay 90s? Mr. Townsend smiled mischievously. "I'm going to set myself up as a mystic and all-purpose fortune-teller of the future. After all, I know a lot about the things that have happened since 1896. I could predict Queen Victoria's death and President McKinley's assassination. I know about the stock market crashes and the wars and who won the American and National League pennants. Before long, I'll be rich and famous. You can read all about me in old books and newspapers, of course." Johnny and Fergie looked at each other in alarm. They really didn't know what to say. Was it possible that Mr. Townsend knew about their secret midnight expedition to Topsfield? If he didn't know, then how had he happened to choose the year that they had? It really was too much of a coincidence to be believed. After giving each other a few nervous looks, they turned to the professor, who was eyeing them strangely and making little hem-hem noises in his throat. "I have something to add to what Al has told you," the professor said solemnly. "He wanted me to take him in the time trolley, but I'm going to let him take the blasted piece of tin and keep it. If it was sitting in my basement, I'd be tempted to use it, then God knows what could happen. We just barely made it back from Constantinople by the skin of our teeth, and I just don't want to take any more silly chances." Johnny, Fergie, and Dr. Coote all muttered their approval. Later, while the others waited, Mr. Townsend changed into an 1890s-style outfit. When he came back, everyone gathered around the door to the professor's fuss closet. For old time's sake, Mr. Townsend wanted to take the secret passage back to the subway tunnel. One by one, the guests clumped down the rickety wooden staircase. At last, everyone stood waiting outside the rear door of the trolley. Mr. Townsend's suitcase was safely inside, and the machine was humming and vibrating. The professor stepped forward and pumped Mr. Townsend's hand vigorously. "Goodbye and good luck, my friend," he said, "and if you happen to run into my grandfather, tell him to avoid horseback riding. He died at the age of 98 when a horse threw him." After a final wave, Mr. Townsend climbed up the iron steps and disappeared under the trolley. The steady hum of the trolley's engine rose to an ear-splitting whine, and the air around the trolley began to waver. Then, with a sudden whoosh, the machine shot forward and disappeared. For a long time, everyone was silent. Finally, Johnny spoke up. "Gee, I hope everything works out okay for him," he said with a worried frown. "Did he take any money with him?" The professor smiled. "Oh, yes, he has about $1,000 in old coins and banknotes. I got them at a rare coin shop in Boston. In 1896, $1,000 will go a long, long way. And he can always come back here." He paused and turned to Johnny and Fergie. "By the way," he said, smiling innocently, "do you think he'll run into the ghost of you two running around Topsfield in the winter of '96? Johnny and Fergie were flabbergasted. Then they stared at the ground, and their faces slowly turned red. How on earth had the professor found out? The professor laughed, and so did Dr. Coote. They had known about the boy's secret for some time, and they had been waiting for a chance to surprise them. When the laughter died down, the professor put his arm around Johnny and smiled warmly. "My boy," he said, "there are a lot of things in this world that you don't know, and that goes for you too, Byron. For one thing, when you set the time machine dial for a certain place in time, the iron pointers inside the dashboard make marks on the paper-covered drums that have the list of times and places. When Mr. Townsend took off the dashboard to replace the burnt-out tube, he noticed that Topsfield and the date December 5th, 1896 had been marked. But he had never gone to Topsfield, and neither had I. That left the possibility that someone else had been fooling around with the trolley, and that someone eats Clark bars." There was a wadded-up wrapper from one in the waste can next to the driver's seat. "And it is a well-known fact that you, Byron, have a passion for Clark bars. So, gentlemen, was it fun?" Fergie grimaced. "It sort of was," he muttered. "Why don't we go upstairs and finish the cake, and we'll tell you all about it?" After another quick glance at the empty trolley tracks, the two boys and the two old men started walking slowly up the dank brick tunnel that led to the professor's basement. All of a sudden, Johnny halted. There was one more loose end, something he had forgotten about. "Hey!" he said. "Professor, what happened with that weird gadget with the handle? You know, the Tabergan. Do you still have it?" The professor said calmly, "No, I left it on a window ledge in Leander's tower. I imagine those ghostly knights will come and get it back, or else it will return to them automatically." Fergie looked exasperated. "Prof!" he exclaimed. "Are you out of your jug? That widget could have made us millions of dollars. Everybody wants something that'll carry them over the world, just like that, zippity-zoo. We could have cleaned up." "Maybe," sighed the professor, who kicked a little stone down the tunnel. "But I felt the Tabergan belonged to the knights. Besides, I hated the way I felt whenever the thing took me anywhere. I got all shaken up and sick to my stomach." "Isn't that old, Roderick?" Dr. Coote put in sarcastically. "Isn't that odd, Roderick?" Dr. Coote put in sarcastically. "That's just the way I feel when I ride with you in your car. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to try the tab again, because I might have preferred it to... With a wild yell, the professor leaped at his friend and tried to put his neck and arms in a full Nelson grip, but Dr. Coop broke free and dashed off down the tunnel, while the boys stared after them and laughed. And that is the end of the Trolley to Yesterday.